Hello all, my name is Jagrati and I'm a trained data science professional. Today I'll be your guide in terms of understanding SQL and few concepts related to it. So without further ado, let's get started. So the learning objective for the session would be what is data? That's the first thing which we are going to understand. Then we are going to understand what are the different types of data which are available to us. Then we are also going to understand what is a database, what is DBMS, and what is an RDBMS. Then we are going to have a quick introduction about what is SQL. So let's get started. So the very first thing which we are going to understand over here is nothing but what is data. When I ask this question, what answer does come to your mind? Many people will say data is information. Many people will say that data is a piece of information. But do you think so that data and information are the two words which seems to be similar, or there is a difference between them? Let's try to understand what is an actual meaning of data and why understanding of data is important for us with respect to this topic. So if I ask you a formal definition of what is data, as I said that many people will say that data is information or data is a piece of information. But actually the data is not called information directly. Data has its definition where it leads to information after doing certain steps. So what is it? Let's see. So when I talk upon what is data, I write data is a raw piece of facts or figures. Now what does this mean? Now when I am explaining that what is data, I am telling you that data is a raw. Raw means it's not processed, it's not clean, it's not untidy, or it's uncooked. The meaning of raw means not completely cooked, which means not completely processed, having lots of errors, having lots of discrepancies which are there. And in the real world scenario, data seems to be raw in nature. And every time in the real world, the data which is processed, the data which is gathered, the data which is extracted is in the form of raw piece. Now, raw pieces of what? Of facts. Now, facts are true values which are there, such as if I am extracting data from the Amazon database, the data which I have extracted is obviously in its raw form. It could have lots of missing values, it could have data in a wrong format, it could also have duplicated entries if possible. Now, but whatever data is being extracted, it's a fact, it's an actual value which I have got. Now, similarly, if someone is providing me images, audios which are there, and that needs to be processed further, cleaned further, that is also a fact which is given to me. So when I talk upon raw piece of fact, which means an actual value which is given to me, or figures in the sense numbers, the basic nature of data is into numeric format. So when I talk upon the definition of data, initially the data is termed to be as raw pieces of facts and information, facts or figures, which is processed further. Now what is the meaning of processed further and why processing is required? As I said, the real world data which is captured by the data set, or which is captured by an organization, or which is captured by lots of companies or by softwares, could have discrepancy into it, and those discrepancies needs to be cleaned. Now in order to clean that discrepancy, that is converting a raw information into a tidy set of information that seems to be relevant, that seems to be readable, that seems to be understandable as well. So that's why processing is required. And processing further means without getting a proper understanding, without getting a proper relevant data, I would not be able to derive information. Why? Because if, let's say, someone is extracting a data and giving to me and asking me, tell me what you find from the data. unless and until I process it, unless and until I understand it, unless and until I clean it, I would not be able to make sure or make you explain or make the person explain that what does data consist of. So the meaning or the importance of processing it further requires having a good understanding of the data, interpretation of the data, and knowledge with respect to how the data needs to be cleaned, how the data needs to be converted into a relevant format, and then how the data needs to be transferred and help in terms of gaining meaningful information. So when I talk upon data is a raw piece of facts and figures which is processed further to gain or derive meaningful information. Now, when the data turns into information, that when the data is being processed. So that's the formal definition of what is data. So unless and until you process it, you clean it, you transform it, or you make it relevant into the thing where it can be understood by the human and interpreted by the human very easily, that's when we call it as an information. So when I talk upon data, data is a raw piece of facts or figures which is processed further in order to gain meaningful information. Now, what are those facts related to? Now, as we see in the real world, we get lots of amount of data. It could be in form of numbers, it could be in form of text, it could be in form of audios, videos, documents, and so on. So, the data includes numeric information, that is numbers, images, audios, videos, and lots of things. So lots of varieties of data are possibly available to us in the recent world scenario. But what is data? Data is a raw piece of facts which would be processed further in order to gain meaningful information. So when I have a data, why do you think so? Data processing is required, and why understanding of data is very important. As we are studying this topic, or we are studying the concept related to data science, as the name suggests of the topic, that is data science, the science of understanding the data. Unless and until I know what is the type of data, I know the discrepancy in the data, or I don't process the data clearly, I would not be able to derive any information. I would not be able to derive any conclusive meaning of the data. So that's the reason why data is one of the most crucial thing to understand in the field of data science. And all the concepts of data science are purely dependent on one factor, that is the literacy of data, that is the familiarity of the data. If I am not familiar with the data which I am using, the understanding which I am trying to derive will not be fruitful enough for gaining meaningful conclusions from it. And that's when data is important, and understanding the data is also important. So let's try to see how does the data looks like in a technical terms. So as I said, data refers to raw facts which has no specific meaning. So at the initial go, the data is known as a raw piece of facts which has no specific meaning in the initial part. Now the data as a word is derived from a Latin word known as datum. Now what is the purpose, or what is the meaning of datum over here? Datum means something is given. So as you know that when a data is provided, there is something which is given. But in order to know what thing is given, you will be processing it further. So the meaning of datum means something is given to you in Latin. Now the data is independent of information, which means if the data is given to you at the very first go and the client says, give me information, you cannot look at the data and give the information at instant. You have to understand it, you have to clean it, you have to process it, and then you will derive some meaningful information. So data at the first go is independent of information. Now the data are raw data which is not enough for making decisions. Now why it is not enough to make decisions? Imagine that there is a data which has 10 columns, and out of those 10 columns, 5 columns are not having any meaning, or let's say 3 columns are duplicatedly repeated. Now one of the column is having lots of missing values, and then if you say this is the information which I have derived without cleaning it further, the decisions which you made are unpure, the decisions which you made are not so relevant, and the decisions which you have are not so sufficient enough for your analysis. For an example, if I show you, let's say, I have data related to ID, name of the customer, age of the customer, and what is the amount being paid. Or let's say not the amount, but let's say the location where the customer is belonging. Now I'm storing customer's data over here. Now customer ID 101, name is A, let's say age is 23 and the location over here is Mumbai. And I write one more time that customer ID 101, name is A, the age is 23 and the location seems to be what, Mumbai. Now again I can write 103, name as B, age as 25, and let's say I write the location as Pune. So when I have entered the data, as you can see, if someone is asking me how many customers are there into your database or how many customers are there into your data, I'll obviously say how many customers are there into my data? 3. So the data consists of 3 customers information. But is the value actually 3? So as per the question asked by the client, he is asking me how many customers are there into the data, and I gave an answer of 3. But there was one discrepancy in that data, that is the customer 101 has a duplicated entry. So ideally there are not 3 customers. If I try to remove this duplicated entry which is there, if I try to remove this, and then when a client asks me how many customers are there with me, instead of 3, I actually have how many customers? 2. But what if I would have not examined my data? What if I would have not explored my data in such a way that I don't know that there is a duplicacy in the data, and I didn't treat it the way it was supposed to be treated because I was not knowing that the data is having duplicacy. So if I don't do this, and if I conclude that there were 3 customers, my decisions which are made are not pure enough. The decisions which are made are not so sure enough that it's correct or incorrect. And raw piece of information or a raw data which is given cannot be directly deriving any decisions or cannot be directly used in order to derive any decisions. And this is why processing of data is very important. So this was about data. Now let's see what is about information. So let me clear this out. So when I talk upon information, now information refers to a processed data that has purpose or meaning. What does it mean? As I have showed you in the earlier example, when I remove the duplicacy, which means the duplicated customer entries are being removed and each customer has a unique entry in my data. So now my data has a purpose that I am finding unique customers into my data set, and it gave me a meaning that how many unique customers were there? There were 2 unique customers with me. So information refers to processed data, that is a clean data, that is a cooked data, that is a tidy form of data which has some purpose and some meaning. Now information is also derived from a Latin word known as information, that is formation of conception. Now formation of conception means formation of something, formation of knowledge, formation of analysis, and so on. So the Latin meaning of information is formation of conception, which means I am trying to form something, I am trying to formulate something over here. Now as said that information is dependent on data. Now what does that mean? Unless and until I have raw piece of fact, I would not be able to derive any information. So a raw piece of fact is important to have a meaningful information from the data, and that's why it is dependent on information. Now the information is sufficient enough to help decide in a respective context. As we saw in the earlier example, the information, that is the unique number of customers, elimination of duplicacy was helpful enough in order to make the conception, in order to make a relevant outcome, in order to show a proper result set. And that's why information seems to be a lot of important for my data analysis. So if someone is asking, is data an information? It's halfway correct. Now data is a raw piece which will be processed in order to gain meaningful information. So I hope we understood that what is data and what is information.